Good afternoon. Welcome to our second Inspire Your Future live talk with Dr. Sharon Wheatley, and I'm going to hand over to her. Enjoy. Thank you for coming.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. I just thought I'd just give you a quick background about me. I went to a normal state school in a small town in Lincolnshire, and it seemed to me my best option for getting on and getting out of a small town in Lincolnshire was to go straight to college from school. But I didn't have a very clear idea what I did want to do. I had a mixed background, chemistry, biology, geography were my A-levels. But I particularly enjoyed geography, and he was my favourite teacher, and I wanted to go to London, so I went to UCL and did geography. Now, coming out of college, of course, geography doesn't really equip me for any particular career. It does give you lots of skills, though. You've got the maths and calculation type of end of physical geography, and then the more discursive social sciences end of geography, which I ended up finding that I enjoyed more than the science while I was studying there. But of course I came out of college then with a number of skills but no particular clear career path, and I didn't have a very clear idea of what I did want to do either. And so I trained to be a secretary because that gave me an entree into lots and lots of jobs. There were at that time a lot of secretarial positions, and a number of jobs required somebody with a degree to do the secretarial work as well. So I was very lucky. I ended up with some quite decent positions, like the executive assistant to a managing director of an oil company. And then I went and did some temporary work before I was planning to travel around the world, which I did do. But I was temping for GEC, and they offered to train me as a quality engineer. And so that's how I fell into engineering. I do wish in some ways that I considered engineering as an option when I was younger and actually studied it, because it is a really enjoyable area to work in. There's some things that I particularly like about it. Having worked doing a lot of admin work, I don't get a lot of satisfaction about moving paper from one pile to another pile and having very similar jobs to do most days of the week and never really being an end to a job. One of the great things about engineering is that very often you're working on a project, and it's a clear project, and you know what the deadlines are, and you know what you're due to produce. You're also working with a multidisciplinary team, and that can make it really good fun. It's also technically demanding in some ways, because working as a quality engineer, my role was to try and prevent problems before they became problems. That's the whole purpose of it. Not to spend our time fixing things that have gone wrong, but to have a process that makes sure we never get anything wrong, or as infrequently as possible we get things wrong. So I particularly like the tangible element of engineering. It doesn't matter whether it's software or whether it's hardware, or whether it's a bit of both. At the end of an engineering project, there is nearly always some tangible product. It may be a design project, because I worked in research and development in GEC, so we might only be producing 3 prototypes of something. And I did, one of the roles I most enjoyed was when I moved from quality engineering to take over management of a project where they were struggling with resourcing, and collected speech data for phone recognition. And that was sponsored by the EU. And there were 18 different countries in Europe all working together. And it was an enormously rewarding part of a big team. And the people that I worked with from overseas were all really helpful, really nice to work with. And overall, it was a very, very rewarding. The day we handed it over, and we got good feedback, that was one of the most rewarding things I've worked on in my career. So I would say, you know, it doesn't matter if it's engineering, but project work in itself has some clear benefits to me, which is I've got clear plans. I know what I need to achieve by the end of the week, and it will be different next week. It won't be the same job over and over again. We're moving down a track and we can see progress, and I really like that. The other kind of role that I was involved in when I was quality assurance was to do management systems audits. Now, these are not the same as doing accounting audits. We're not just looking at figures. What I'm interested in is how is the work done? are we getting things right? And quite often I would open the audit by meeting somebody and saying to them, what's preventing you from doing your job well? I'm not there to blame somebody for things going wrong. Sometimes audits are seen as a kind of adversarial type of activity. That's not the case if you're working as a management systems auditor. You're part of a team that's aiming to improve processes. And I know that this worked quite well, particularly if you really focus on the systems and not the people. If something's gone wrong, there must be a system problem, because people don't deliberately do things wrong very often in their careers. I mean, I've come across very, very few people who would deliberately avoid doing something that they should be doing. But very often processes don't make it easy for people to get things right first time. And I know that that worked well, because after I'd been auditing some people for some time, they would actually contact me and say, could you come and just have a look? I've made a change or two to the way we're doing something, and I'd like you to come over and have an audit. So I know that they didn't see it as that adversarial thing. They regarded it as helpful. Not only that, you can really save companies a lot of money if you do a good job. And it's really interesting, because we want to go in and see how are people doing the work. I can learn from that. I can see really good practice in some places, and then I can use that elsewhere. I have to be careful as an auditor, though. It's not consultancy. I don't recommend what changes should be made, because you can't overlap from auditing, where what I'm really trying to identify is weaknesses in systems and make clear what those weaknesses are. And so far as possible, and this is something that's really central to quality assurance, is to find the root cause of the problem. And so there's an element of detecting, and I like problem solving. So I'm trying to work out what's really causing the kind of problem. But I was invited to do an audit at an external firm, and there were a team of 3 of us, and at the end of that audit, it was very clear that our findings were going to make a huge impact. They were struggling financially, but they'd got £400,000 worth of material tied up in inventory where they hadn't decided whether they could reprocess it or put it into scrap, for instance. And I know they found that helpful, because they contacted me subsequently and offered to double my salary if I joined their company. So our audit is not always that fearful, bad thing that people tend to think it is. And I think if it's approached with the right attitude, it can be really a rewarding activity. So don't think of it as something that's just checking. It's really broad. You're looking at all the kinds of activities that go on, and some of it is quite technical, adding up, working out whether things are working well by using numbers to analyze where the failures are occurring, for instance. And other times it really is just talking to people, understanding what sorts of problems they might be having, and if they are having problems, what could we do to resolve those problems. So now moving along, I have also decided that I would like to return to education, and 20 years later I went back to college. I'd sort of decided a bit more what it was that I liked doing by this time, and I realised that my job was really only risk management. Every day, all I was thinking about was, how can I prevent this becoming a problem? And that really is the basis of risk management. It's not all about doing hard maths. If you do like hard maths and you want to do that kind of risk management, then I think the insurance business is the place to be going, because they do actuarial calculations that need lots and lots of data in order to do the statistics that come out with reasonably accurate predictions. And that kind of risk management is where the foundations of the subject lie. However, if we look at most companies, the sources of risk are so broad. For most of them, you will not have a good data set that you can use for statistical analysis. So if we think about some of the sources of risk, one of them that's quite often discussed is regulation. So regulatory change, for instance, one change that's been taking a very long time to make any difference is the equal pay for men and women. Now, that legislation has been in place for a number of years. However, I think most of us are aware that most women are not being paid equally. And at the moment, companies are not being fined. But the risk is that at some point the government may decide they want to enforce that regulation more strongly, and they may introduce fines. And how big these will be, there is no maths that we could use to calculate that. It's a decision that someone else is going to take that's entirely outside the control of the business. And so we're saving money if we don't do it for the moment. But if they decide to punish us and we have to do it, then there will be a big bill at the same time. So that is probably, as you can imagine, a piece of legislation that is something I'm interested in. But there are all kinds of different types of legislation that companies have to think about. How are we going to comply? Are we fully compliant? How much is it going to cost us? And that's another thing where being good at analysing systems and processes in businesses, we need to comply but not have too much red tape. So basically, those kinds of design decisions, how are we going to comply, often holds up a number of companies. And the worst thing is to find you've spent a lot of time doing it and you're still struggling to comply with something. And we never really know how is the regulator going to check this until it actually becomes enforced. So those banks that have been fined for payment protection insurance never imagined there would come a point where the government would say you're going to have to pay all this back. But it's cost them a lot of money. And I think at the time of making that decision, should we sell that kind of insurance to people who won't be able to make use of it without telling them? Now I say it like that, I think you can see there's an ethical problem there. And one of the problems that this links back to is the idea of ethical decision making in business. So some of what the risks are relate to whether we're behaving ethically or not in our decision making at senior level and further down the company. So if, for instance, we think about the Volkswagen cheat device, I think most of you will be aware that that particular decision to, instead of saying, let's go back and delay production by a few weeks while we resolve this problem and get a compliant result without using the cheat device, instead of that, they said, oh, all right, we'll just use the cheat device. They won't know. But of course, people did find out. And so that's an example of a risk where it would be very, very difficult to use maths to add it up. But for me, if I was to say, is that ethical, that would help me make a decision about that. And I find it quite hard to see how a system can be allowed to run where nobody in that room said that is going to cost them a company a lot more money in the long run. It wouldn't have cost that much just to delay production schedules. It would have cost some money, obviously, but by comparison with the costs overall for the decision that was made there, it would have been quite minor. And the other kind of thing is that there's an international standard called ISO 26000, which deals with how companies should think about whether they're behaving ethically. And it has 6 clear areas about how you treat your customers and things like this. But what it really says is, when we're making decisions, is there anybody in the room who, there will always be somebody who says, is this profitable? But that isn't enough. What we need to say is this fair to our customers? Is this something I could tell my mum about this decision and I wouldn't feel embarrassed? If my name was associated with this decision on the front page of the paper tomorrow, would I find that embarrassing? If the answer to that is yes, then you need to think about whether you're making good decisions. And so risk management is a far more to do with how businesses conduct themselves, which may not be what most people think about when they think about risk management. It's not to say you can't be doing some maths, but most of it really is more about how we're doing business, understanding our competition, looking at the way the environment is changing in which we operate. And so I think overall, going back to college, I did my PhD looking at the risk management implementation in universities in the UK. One university asked me to go and look at how they were implementing the regulation from HEFC, and I found in 5 years of long study that basically it was nothing to do with adding things up. It was to do with being aware of threats to your business, being aware of where they're coming from. And what I found was there were two parallel systems working. And I think this is quite common in many businesses. They will have a risk register, and that might show some elements of maths, very often not a lot. And that'll be the things they think a regulator might want them to put on the list. But if I actually look at the minutes of senior management meetings, I find there are several other real risks that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. The risk register only gets updated once a year. You can't manage risk once a year. It doesn't work. You need to be doing it every day. And most companies are really, really good at doing it every day. You know, companies don't survive 50 years if they're not good at risk management. So I hope that just gives you a little bit of an overview of the kinds of areas I've worked in. And I would say now that I'm working as a teacher. I didn't really expect to end up doing that either. Most of my career has been completely unplanned, a lot of luck. Meeting people that I've enjoyed working with is one of the real pleasures of work. And I do think one of the things that is important is that you have to remember, just because you're at work, doesn't mean you can't have fun. Really, work should be something that you actually enjoy being at work and working with the people. And so quite often it's not as important what you're doing as it is the kind of environment you're working in and who you're working with and what kind of management team you've got overseeing the way you work. And so but I must say that I do find teaching extremely rewarding, and I'm quite surprised how I've kind of moved into a completely different field in my 50s, and I'm really enjoying it. So the main threat for me with any job is boredom. As long as I'm learning new things, I'm a happy woman. So I think that's about as much as I can say on the topic, and I'd be really happy to take any questions.
That's perfect. Thank you so much for speaking. We've got a few questions, so I can ask you a few of those now. So if someone wanted to go into engineering, what would you recommend?
I would recommend having some maths. On the whole, one of the things about the type of engineering I did is quality engineering is a relatively specialised field, but it did mean I didn't have to be either a mechanical engineer or an electrical engineer or a software engineer. I had to have a little bit of skill in each of those, enough to ask experts that I knew to review things I was worried about. So you can choose to specialise. You need to think about what is it that you're interested in. Most things will have a software element now, and I have worked doing some programming, and I did work as a software quality engineer, and I did enjoy that work as well. So I still regard that as a tangible product. Overall, I would say that most engineering companies will be looking for people who do have that maths at least. But yeah, other skills, I think when I was talking about projects, interpersonal skills are exceedingly important, even in engineering. I think people sometimes think engineering is just a technical thing where everyone's sitting doing their special thing. But really, to get a project to work well, it's getting all the different bits of it to work together. And there are some roles in that. And so if you start in any one of the areas that you really find most interesting, say, for instance, you want to do electrical engineering, there'll come a point where you can get to a project leader role where you're interacting with all kinds of different engineering specialisms, and having your own area of expertise is nice. But for me, I quite liked having a more overview type of position. So not being a very traditional engineer, I think that's it's I would certainly think about approaching a company like BAE Systems, for instance, and looking at their graduate scheme, because I worked for BAE Systems in my latter half of, I got transferred from GEC to GEC Marconi to BAE Systems. And what was really strong in GEC was their apprenticeship scheme. It was a 7-year apprenticeship. I didn't work with anybody who wasn't very, very good at what they did. And I think BAE Systems have started to do a very similar apprenticeship. It may not be quite as intense. You had to work in every department when the GEC one I was involved with. They also paid for you to do master's qualifications if you had a specialism by that stage, say year 5 of your apprenticeship. They'd be happy to pay for it. But I think it would be really worth looking into what apprenticeships are there and whether there's a qualification route through an apprenticeship.
That's perfect. And what skills do you think are important for project managers?
There's a general consensus in the academic literature that it's not so much about technical skills, it's far more about communication. Obviously, you need people who do know their job. So the project I managed, for instance, I was able to pick a couple of engineers whose skills I knew complemented mine. They were really strong technically, which I am not, but I am quite strong in terms of communication, organisation, putting processes in place. So between us, we had the top layer, and then so for instance, I had regular points during the week at which I spoke to everybody together, and it was an informal Monday morning coffee was the time when we reviewed what happened the week before, what we needed to achieve this week, what had been a problem and what we were going to do with it, if anything. And then we would just all go and press on with what we were doing. But there needed to be a point at which, and I also had a subcontractor who really wasn't delivering, and I had to put some extra time into that. I just said to them, I'm going to be at your office every Thursday morning at 10 o'clock until you get this right. And it did improve their performance quite considerably. But obviously, I had to put some time into that every week to go there, say, OK, where are we? What have you done to improve what you're doing? I think after about 5 weeks, I began to be able to not have to call into their office. But so you've got to kind of be able to enforce things with certain areas in terms of making sure that things are actually happening, and if they're not happening, trying to make sure that you move them along more quickly. On the other hand, building this team where you all feel like you're working together. So this project I worked on went right over Christmas, and it needed somebody to go in and change data tapes. We were collecting huge amounts of data, and I didn't have a single day when someone from the team didn't volunteer to go in and do that, even though none of us lived very near work. So everybody took their share. I wasn't left being the manager and having to go in and do it myself every day. And I do think it is project management skills are very useful in terms of, for instance, getting your Gantt chart, knowing what you're going to do on which dates. But what I've most often noticed as a weakness is a lack of review points. If I'm auditing, one of the things that very, very often happens is people assume things are going well. Nobody has put something in the programme to say, who's checking we're doing it well? Do we all know where we are? So, oh, sorry, just decline that. So, yes, so there's various skills, but overall getting your team to all work together if you're managing a project is the most, and academic literature does say really it's the people skills that count.
Brilliant. I know we're sort of running low on time, so moving into sort of the auditing, so what would you say is auditing would be that, is that a good career for someone who enjoys problem solving?
Yes, I would say so. I really would. And not only that, yes, because you are just looking at things and saying, OK, so that went wrong. But it's not always obvious why it went wrong. And I think one of the reasons, for instance, that I did do a forensic engineering qualification was because that was a specialism that none of my close colleagues had. And so if it did come down to something that was a mechanical failure, it was useful for me to have that background to help to identify problems in that area. But very often the people doing the work really do know what's wrong, but they're afraid perhaps to tell their bosses what the problem really is. And so it's drawing that out and then trying to think about how this can be improved. But as I say, when you're working as an auditor, you're really not officially allowed to give consultancy advice. And so it has to be done in quite a careful way, such that the explanation of the problem more or less leads into the answer that they're looking for. But I've really always enjoyed trying to resolve problems, and auditing uncovers an enormous number of them. Most companies are in a constant state of change, and that tends to lead to, for instance, departments. You always think things run smoothly across the boundaries, but very often they don't. And so people in this department have got a problem that comes from this department, but they didn't know that. And so being able to talk to the different people and get them to understand each other is another part of that kind of activity as well.
Yeah, I believe you touched on this as well already, but so would you say that ethics links into risk management?
I would say it's very heavily linked into risk management. I think if we look into the banks have really been penalised for a number of decisions in recent years. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the kinds of fines that have been imposed on banks for, well, things like fixing the bank base rate between themselves, really doing things that are actually, this I did find surprising, because it's not even just ethical, it's illegal. So I would have a kind of priority of asking, for instance, is it profitable might be the first thing we might be interested in about a decision at work. Second thing, I can't believe they didn't ask, is it illegal? Because if it is, you really shouldn't be doing it. Then there's a more subtle level of, is it something that people would think badly of us for? And I think, again, it's very hard to measure, because if we think about the Rana Plaza building collapse, I guess some of you know that a number of clothing shops in the UK were getting clothes made in a building in Pakistan. There were cracks in the building, the workers had complained, nobody had done anything, and when the building collapsed, it killed people. Now, the thing is, did it stop people going to shop at any of those shops that were actually getting their clothes there? And I've asked a number of students in my class, did this change your buying behaviour? And I knew they knew about it, and some of them came from that part of the world. And the answer they gave me was no. And so that's why you can't add it up, because I would have thought it would have an impact, but that's just what I think. And you won't know until after the event. I think YouTube has seen some of those kinds of impacts where it's really unquantifiable how people will respond if somebody says something and it's really publicised and it's really seen to be not the sort of thing you should be doing, or if you're allowing people to say things on your platform that are seen to be exceedingly unethical. So I think if you think about it, a number of problems in terms of kind of share price values and falls have to do with how customers perceive the company, and it's a very hard thing to understand.
That's brilliant, really interesting. Just one final point. What would your top tip be on avoiding boredom in work? I know you mentioned that at the end.
Okay, that's a good question, and I'll tell you the answer because I do know it. Never say no to doing something you're scared of. So a number of my jobs were things where somebody said, well, for instance, with that project management, they said, oh, 5 of the team have left, can you pick that up? I was a bit like, it's not a subject I know. I've got no background in speech recognition technology, and it was really scary for the first 2-3 weeks. But the amount I learned was incredible. And you're never bored while you're learning. I've had a number of jobs where I've had a very, very steep learning curve in the first sort of 2 months. Some of it keeps you awake at night, but it's worth it, because in the end, you get to the point where you've learned some really useful skills. I've got a wide range of different things I feel able to do. And I think that's one of the reasons I find teaching quite satisfying, because I'm not sure you could ever really finish learning new things about teaching. So yeah, challenge yourself, and don't be scared. Make sure that when you're working, you've got some supportive. In that case, one of the reasons I was willing to take that big risk, my boss at that time was really a very supportive person. I could have gone to him with a problem at any time, and I knew that. And in fact, for the majority of my career, I've had really strong supportive managers, which means you feel able to take that risk. So it's being in the right environment where if you're struggling, you're going to get some help, but you will learn quickly if you're in at the deep end.
That's brilliant, and I think that's drawn us to a close. Thank you very much for speaking. I'm sure it's going to be one to inspire lots of students. I really appreciate it. And if you're watching, feel free to follow our social medias and you can find out about all our latest talks. Thank you very much.
No, thank you.